Welcome to another episode of the GayBarchives show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and our guest today is the self-proclaimed writer, traveler, translator, tour guide, and bourbon drinker, David Dominé. Welcome to the show, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I'm kind of interested to find out a little bit more. I know from your background that you are somewhat of a historian and a writer, and you've got all these other things going on. And I'd like to start off with talking a little bit about Louisville, Kentucky, which is your current home and has the unique distinction of being known as Glitter Ball City. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Louisville?
Yeah, so I'm not from Louisville originally. I moved there in 1993. I went to do a stint at law school. I had no desire to go to Louisville, Kentucky. I'm from Wisconsin originally, most of my 20s at that time. I'd been living and working in Europe. So Louisville was the last place, I had in mind. But I ended up there, and what I thought was going to be a year or two turned out being half of my life. So it kind of became my new hometown, my adopted hometown. It's the place where I've lived longest any place. And so for me, Louisville, Kentucky, it feels like home. And, it's not a huge city. You throw in all the outlying areas and, the greater metropolitan area they call Louisville. It's a little over 1 million people. So it's not a huge city. It's usually, classed as a second tier city. And a lot of people, they don't know what to expect when they come to Louisville, Kentucky. A lot of people know things, they know Kentucky Fried Chicken. A lot of people know Muhammad Ali was from Louisville. They know about the Louisville Slugger, but there's a lot of local pride and things that are distinctly, Kentuckian or Louisvillian. It's a big bourbon city, if you can imagine that. Horse racing is huge. Churchill Downs is right down the road from where I used to live. So every May we have the huge Run for the Roses. And the locals, they kind of embrace the quirks and the eccentrics and the things that make Louisville an interesting place to live. And one of them is the fact that, among other nicknames, they call Louisville Glitter Ball City, because at the height of the world's disco craze, at the 70s and 80s, guess where most of the world's disco balls were coming from? They were coming from a company in Louisville, Kentucky called Omega National Products. Back in the 70s and 80s, they had a crew of 25 women who would crank them out by hand every day. And today, there's only one of those ladies left. Her name's Yolanda Baker. They call her the reigning queen of disco ball. But of course, she doesn't make as many as she used to. She says that she makes like 7, 8, 9 a week now. That's a lot, because by the late 90s, China had overtaken Louisville because of mass production. So Louisville doesn't make the most of the disco balls, and they call them other things. Omega National Products calls them mirror balls officially, but they were called glitter balls for a time. And whatever you call it, most people know them as disco balls because of the 70s and 80s. And Louisville doesn't make the most of them anymore, but all the high quality, all the best disco balls in the world, they say, are Louisville disco balls. And all the iconic disco balls people know, from gay bars and from TV and movies. That's what John Travolta was dancing under. That was a Louisville disco ball in Saturday Night Fever. It's what they had at Studio 54 in Chicago. It's that big one they had on Soul Train. That was a Louisville disco ball. And it's not surprising this Louisville company would have this tradition making disco balls, because it was a Kentuckian in 1917 already who first patented the very first myriad reflector. And that was kind of the early disco ball. And like I said, they started calling them other things as well. Most people call them disco balls. Where I'm from, that area, we like to call them glitter balls. I think it's a little catchier name. But whatever you call them, Louisville is a city that is known for its production of mirror balls or glitter balls. And that's just one of a number of things the locals like to embrace. They embrace the fact that Louisville is the place where the Happy Birthday song was written in 1893. There's all kinds of little things like that. So that's kind of where the Glitter Ball name comes from. Just one of many things the city kind of embraces as being something uniquely Louisvillian.
And I know a lot of people who watch the GayBarchives show over the many episodes that we've done are big fans of the big gay bars and the discos. And so I just want to point out that if they really are a disco ball fan, they should definitely go to Louisville, because as I understand it, the mayor there proclaimed April 1st as Disco Ball Day, and one of the largest public monuments in the city of Louisville is an 11-foot diameter mirror ball that sits in the city park.
Yeah, it kind of travels around, and you can rent bigger ones for parties and such. Actually, it's someplace in England. I think it's the Isle of Wight. They have the largest disco ball in the world. I think it's like 33 feet in diameter. Well, since disco balls have kind of taken off and the mayor has recognized it as being something valuable to the city, now there's a campaign in Louisville. It's called the world's largest disco ball, y'all. And there's an organization trying to raise money to build a disco ball that is twice as large as the one in England in the Isle of Wight. And ideally it will hang someplace maybe near the factory where they're made. I don't know how they're coming along with it, but they've had events to raise money. I don't know if anything is set in stone yet, but there's a project underway for Louisville to eventually have the largest disco ball in the world.
Well, that sounds very cool.
Yeah, and sounds fitting as well.
Having spent a lot of time in the 80s and 90s living in the South, I lived in Nashville and Atlanta. Yeah. I'm kind of familiar with the way the general feeling of those southern cities is. And so it's a little surprising to find out that Louisville actually has a pretty good history with gay bars and gay places. And one of the ones that I know you're familiar with has a very interesting name to me. It's called Starbase Q. Mm-hmm. What was Starbase Q like?
So, I moved to Louisville in 1993, and there's a pretty thriving gay scene as far as gay bars were concerned. Downtown, there were like 5, gay bars within, 1 or 2 block radius of each other, and that was kind of the place to go. And I'm sure you're going to ask me about The Connection. That was the iconic gay bar for years. But it was, I don't know, I think 2004 or 2005, Starbase Q opened up. And it was kind of at the other end of downtown. It was near 9th Street. And 9th Street in Louisville is kind of the infamous dividing line between black and white Louisville, they say. And that part of West Main Street, it was like warehouses and old factories, kind of industrial until you got into the residential part of the West End. But Starbase Q, and this was at a point where I wasn't going out as much as I used to. So I went several times, but that wasn't my hangout place. That was like the alternative to The Connection. And I think it was around like for 7 years or so. I think closed in 2011, if I remember correctly. But it was a good sized bar. It had kind of, looked like just a lot of times like they do, like kind of an abandoned warehouse from the outside. It was a big old brick building right by, the entrance ramp to the highway that runs by. But they had a good sized dance floor. There was a smaller dance floor. There was a performing area where, especially on the weekends, they would have drag shows. And then, there was kind of the bar and a seating area. It wasn't huge. I mean, it was good size, not compared to The Connection, though. Connection was huge. But that was like the alternative for a number of years. People not wanting to go to the Connection would go to Starbase Q. From what I remember, it was attracting more of a younger crowd. By that point, as often happens, with gay bars, some nights it seemed like there were more straight people there, especially bachelorette parties and things. So Starbase Q kind of became the alternative for Connection, the iconic big gay bar in the city.
Now, I have researched thousands of gay bars across the country, most of which are no longer in business. And that name is just distinctive. I get the impression that the owner was a big fan of like Star Trek and sci-fi type stuff. Is that where the name came from?
That's what I heard. I don't know for a fact, but it did have that kind of sleek spaceship kind of look on the inside in parts, especially with there were neon lights, purple lights and stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. I don't know for a fact, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case.
Yeah, and their logo to me looks like kind of a twisted version of the Starship Enterprise or something. That Q with
Kind of
coming out. So
yeah, and most people in town they just call it Q. So we're going to go to Q tonight. So that's what most people called it.
Yeah, it took me a while to track the information down on that bar for that very reason, because hardly anybody referred to it as Starbase Q, and people would say, "Oh, the Q,"
Yeah.
And I think even one of the early mentions in your book, A Dark Room in Glitterball City, you refer to a conversation with Ramon, and he said, "Oh, we met him at the Q." And I kept looking and looking, where's the Q? And then finally I tracked down the fact that it was called Starbase Q officially.
Yeah, exactly. That's why.
Now, before we get to the Connection, there was another little bar that was opened apparently by one of the main antagonists in your book called Fuzion.
Yeah.
And that was in a part of town called Butchertown.
Yes.
What is Butchertown?
So the downtown area, there's the main commercial corridor that kind of centers around 4th Street, the old shopping district going down to the river where you have Main and Market Street. On West Main, West Market, that's where you get to 9th Street. That's where Starbase Q was. But then going the other direction, East Main and East Market, that's where you get to a part of town called Butchertown. And it's called Butchertown because that's where a lot of the city slaughterhouses were. And it was an area of primarily German and Irish immigrants. A lot of them lived in small shotgun houses, which is the kind of architecture Louisville is especially known for. It's where Thomas Edison lived for a time in the 1860s. He operated the telegraph at Western Union in downtown Louisville for a couple of years. So he lived in a house in that area. And I think there's one slaughterhouse left. So the slaughterhouses have kind of gradually left, but they still call it Butchertown. Just because of the history of all the slaughterhouses and the stockades being down there. One of the big banks down there is called Stockyards, kind of harkens back to that Butchertown history. And at one point, in the 1800s, Louisville was a city that rivaled Chicago for being a pork producing center of the country. So there were a lot of slaughterhouses and stockyards down there. But today, it's mostly just little neighborhoods of old houses. A lot of the houses are from the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 90s, kind of that time period. And that's where Fuzion was, and that didn't last for very long. It's also where the city's probably only and really well-known lesbian bar was located. It was called Tinks, and that was around for 10 years. That actually closed the same year that Starbase Q did, 2011, if I'm recalling correctly. But yeah, it was. I'd only been there once. It was a little place. Strangely enough, when the Connection closed in 2016, that was the big gay bar. The place that kind of took over called Play, that is actually in the Butchertown area right now. But yeah, Fuzion was a smaller place. It had a clubby kind of after hours, kind of house party feel to it, you could say. But the antagonist you were referring to, that's one of the guys in the book. His name was Joey Banis, and he was well, a lot of people said he never was a manager. So a lot of people said he was a self-proclaimed manager at Starbase Q. But he was a very well-known bartender, and he stood out. He was quite flamboyant. He usually was shirtless and had ratty jeans held up with, studded belts. But he would always come into work painted up in fluorescent body paints, and sometimes he might have a bright blue mohawk. So he was quite well known on the scene just because he stood out physically. He came from a kind of well-to-do family in town, was kind of known to be the bad boy of the family. But he had a faithful clientele. What people said is he made very good drinks and he was generous with his pours. So that probably endeared him to a lot of club goers. But he ended up leaving Starbase Q, and depending on who you talk to, there's different reasons. He claimed a number of different things. He also claimed he was part owner when he went to Starbase Q, and he claimed he was cheated out of his half of the business. And there were some litigation matters that never were resolved as far as I know. But when he went to Fuzion, and it was Fuzion with a Z, Fuzion, a lot of his clients from Starbase Q kind of followed him to Fuzion for the brief time he was there. And from what I understand, it really hurt Starbase Q. It was one of the reasons that they eventually closed, because they were just losing. It used to be you'd go on the weekend, on the weeknights, and it was packed. But then you go on the weekends and there'd be 30 people there. So supposedly Joey taking clients with him was one of the factors. The other thing is, things were changing. More people were going on, social media sites and meeting people that way. It just kind of happened all over the country that, gay bars weren't the only place to go out and meet people. So it was one of the contributing factors, from what I hear, for why Starbase Q closed. But yeah, Fuzion wasn't around for very long. And wherever he was, though, Joey Banis had problems with being a little generous with tips. He liked to give himself tips on other people's credit cards and stuff. So there's just dozens and dozens of people, if you bring up Joey Banis's name in Louisville, from his days as a bartender or a self-professed club owner. Everyone you talk to, this, I remember I went to Q one night and my drink, the tab was $60, and I went home the next morning, there was $300 extra on my credit card. So he had kind of a reputation for stealing and stealing credit cards, people's IDs and stuff. And the same thing happened at Q when he left Q, and what happened at Fuzion, as far as I know. But yeah, Fuzion was a much smaller place, and it didn't last for very long.
I've heard some rumors from some of my research that Joey was one of the owners of Fuzion. Is that another thing that he just made up, or was he actually?
Well, I've seen no proof that he was an owner. He said he was an owner. But I know people involved with the bar, they said he was never an owner. So it depends on who you talk to. I never found any proof other than Joey saying he was an owner. And like I did mention, there was a lawsuit. Nothing ever came to fruition because Joey ended up being charged with murder and going to prison. But there was a lawsuit in the works where he was, claiming that part of his club had been stolen. So there is some kind of litigation that was ongoing that does seem to intimate that maybe he was part owner. of that place.
So far we've touched on Starbase Q, which was a decent sized club, and Fuzion, which was a much smaller club.
Yes.
The third club that I want to talk about in Louisville is a club that I have some tangential contact with. It's called The Connection. And while I was living in Nashville, and then later when I moved to Atlanta and visited Nashville to see friends, I used to go to a club called The Connection there. And that was like a spinoff of the one from Louisville. The one in Nashville was massive. I mean, it was like being in a shopping mall. You had a huge dance room. You had a huge show bar that looked like a Broadway theater. You had a huge country western bar. You had a retail store that was bigger than most, freestanding retail stores. It was just a monstrous property. What was the one in Louisville like?
That's how the one in Louisville was like. I take my friends from like New York City and Los Angeles. They come to town. I take them to The Connection, and their jaws would just drop. They'd say they'd never seen anything that big in New York or Los Angeles. But it was the same thing. It was a whole complex. It took up half a city block, and it had, if I remember correctly, it opened in 1988 and closed in 2016. So in that like 30 years or so it was around. It, was remodeled and changed around. But when I first went there, they had a restaurant in the place. There was a martini and a piano bar, and there was a shower bar. And those, you could just go whenever. There was no cover. But then if you crossed over into the other side where you had to pay cover, that's where you'd go off to the side, and there was a stripper bar. And then you left that, and behind that was an enormous dance floor with a raised level bar that went around half of it, and then another bar on the other side. And then when you left the dance floor, which was huge, then you could go out to an outdoor patio that had a bar, and that was huge. And then you'd leave that, and that would take you into the show bar, which was huge. I don't remember the show bar sat hundreds of people, and there was a huge bar all along the back wall. They usually had like 7 or 8 bartenders. Bathrooms were back there. But they had their own cast of, performers, and weekend drag shows were huge there. And like I said, it was huge. Like people from major cities would come to Louisville. We take them to The Connection, and it was always the same reaction. They couldn't believe that there was a gay bar that big in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's a shame. It's a shame it's gone. They tore it down. There's a hotel there now. But since they're gone, like I said, Play in Butchertown, which also has one in Nashville. I think it started in Nashville, and then they did their second one in Louisville. But that you talk to Louisvillians in the gay community, and The Connection is the iconic gay bar. Everyone knows The Connection.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Atlanta for a long time, and I always thought Backstreet was big, and some of the bars that I went to. But The Connection in Nashville, I seem to remember the show bar being set up a lot like one of those multiplex movie theaters where you had stage seating. It wasn't everybody was on one floor and you had to look over other people's heads.
Yeah, it was kind of like an auditorium feel. You went down there were several different levels as you went down to the stage area. Yeah,
and
definitely.
at the top level, there was a big long bar, so you could stand at the bar there, order your drinks, and you were looking over the entire crowd down to the huge performance stage where they could do production numbers. They had a runway coming up the middle of the stage so they could interact with the audience. I mean, it was a major production. It wasn't like your typical, one drag queen lip syncing to a song. It was a big ordeal.
Yeah, no, they had their own cast. It was called Le Boy La Femme. And, the individuals would perform, but they do group numbers with choreography and great stage setting as well.
And the thing that was particularly nice about it, as you mentioned with the one in Louisville, is that it was a complex. So if you went to the section that was the country western bar, for example, in Nashville, it was a different environment. You didn't have
Mhm.
the show going on in the background. You had your own. It was like being in a separate country western bar or a separate, disco dance bar or a separate, outdoor patio bar. They were all so big and roomy that they could
Mhm.
all have their own personality and attract anybody. You could go with a group of 10 people who didn't like the same kind of music or entertainment, and they would all have a good time somewhere in that bar.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how it was. Exactly.
And that's pretty impressive for a town, the size of Louisville
Yeah.
and a state as conservative as Kentucky is.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's like a lot of southern areas, a lot of conservative areas. Kentucky's a very red state, but Louisville is a very blue oasis in the middle of a conservative state. So Louisville itself is a very, very progressive, a very welcoming city for the most part.
Now, I kind of was surprised the same way. What part of Wisconsin are you from?
Well, I grew up in the center of the state. It's a small little town called Wisconsin Rapids. Not much, nobody knows anything about anything from Wisconsin Rapids, other than it's officially the geographic heart of the state. And right down the road in Plainfield, that's where famous serial killer Ed Gein was from. So he's probably my area's most claim to fame, Ed Gein.
Well,
The guy that Psycho was based on. Yeah.
So you moved to this new place in Louisville. It became your home. You had a gay environment around you that whether or not you went to the bar every weekend, you knew there was a community there. You knew that it was vibrant and interesting, and it kind of gave you a sense of community and belonging there. And you lived more in town in a very stylish neighborhood that had some nice older homes in it. And I remember reading about this one particular house. It was located at 1435 South 4th Street, and
Right.
it was on the market. It was a gigantic house. I mean, as from what I've read recently about it, it was something like 8 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, and what, 6 or 7,000 square feet. I mean, it was a large house.
It's like over 10,000 square feet, 11 bedrooms.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 11 bedrooms. The place I was living in had 6 bedrooms. So yeah, you're talking about Old Louisville, and Old Louisville is immediately adjacent to the downtown area, immediately to the south. And it's kind of a stylish area in that it's full of beautiful old Victorian mansions and old houses. But in the city, it's always kind of been looked down upon because it's close to downtown. And, it's what happened in a lot of downtown neighborhoods by the 60s and 70s. It was run down. A lot of the places were chopped up into student apartments and things like that. So a lot of the old time Louisvillians, they think of old Louisville kind of as a bad part of town. It has kind of an image problem, but it's full of these beautiful old mansions. It's one of the largest historic preservation districts in the country. There's like 1,400 old homes and mansions spread out over 45 square blocks. So, I moved there in '94. I had spent the previous 5 years in Europe, and I thought I kind of knew everything. And I came to Louisville, Kentucky, and I saw these beautiful old houses, this great architecture. I couldn't understand why I'd never heard about the neighborhood. And so that's where I lived when I was going to law school and ended up going to graduate school and teaching at the university. But in 1999, I had a chance. My partner and I, we bought a house on 3rd Street. That's kind of what many considered the old Millionaires Row back in the day. Our house was one of the smaller ones, 6 bedrooms, about 4,000 square feet. But your typical house in old Louisville is about 5,500 square feet, has 8 or 10 bedrooms. And we lived there till 2008. And I got into food writing. I was working on a cookbook, and I was writing travel pieces and columns for magazines while I lived at that house. But the woman we bought it from just kind of offhandedly mentioned that the house was haunted. And I love haunted houses and scary stuff like that, but I don't believe in ghosts myself, so I just didn't really think anything of it. But moved in, and all these crazy things she told me would happen in the house began to happen. I began hearing footsteps in the middle of the night. She told us not to hang pictures on this certain wall because the ghost, Lucy, the poltergeist, she called her, she didn't like pictures on that wall, and she'd knock them down if we put any pictures there. Well, we moved in. What's the first thing I did? I hung a picture on that wall. By the end of that day, the picture was lying face down on the tile floor. The glass was broken out. We could never have a picture on that wall. And long story short, everything she told me would happen happened, kind of a paranormal nature in the house. In the end, I never did see a ghost. I'm still a skeptic today. I say seeing is believing, but paranormal is kind of fascinating, and people love ghost stories, and you don't need to believe in ghosts to enjoy a good ghost story. So what I did is I started meeting people, and with all these old houses, the average house down there has been around like 130 years. And they all had started collecting these stories and writing them down, and that's what got me into writing books. And it turns out a lot of the books were about the old Louisville neighborhood. Well, in 2008, we left the house that we had, the old Whitmer house on 3rd Street. And around the corner, there was this big house, the one you mentioned, at 1435 South 4th Street. Locals called it the Richard Robinson House, named after the first man who had lived there. He had built it, lived there for the first 20 years. He was a kind of dry goods and hardware merchant. But it was huge. It had 11 bedrooms, but they had the old original wine cellar from when the mansion was first built. And being a food writer, I got it into my head I wanted to have a wine cellar. And so we went and looked at the house, but the house was a disaster. The kitchen looked like it was bombed out. The carriage house was falling apart. The wine cellar was a mess. And so we said, no, thanks, and went to the current house where we live today. But then 2 years later, it was the morning of June 18th, 2010, I turned on the news as I was having my morning coffee, and I looked up, and on the screen, they were showing a house, and it looked kind of familiar. And it was cordoned off with, police caution tape, and police were buzzing around, and people were going in and out of the house carrying things. And that's when I realized it was 1435 South 4th Street, the house that we had almost bought. And it turns out that the night before, police had been called to the residence. There was a 911 call, and they thought they were arriving to break up a domestic disturbance. It turns out the guy who bought the house, the guy who had the appointment with the real estate agent after we looked at it, a guy named Jeffrey Munt, who had just moved back to Louisville from Chicago, he bought the house. Well, right after he moved in, he met Joey Banis, the famous bartender down at Starbase Q and Fuzion, and the two started dating, and Joey moved into the house with him. And on 4th Street, people thought it was just two guys living together, fixing up an old house. And what they didn't know is the guys kind of had a dark side to their lives in the house there. And the night before 911 was called, it was Jeffrey. He was barricaded in one of the rooms, one of the bedrooms on the 2nd floor, pleading for the police to come because he said Joey had a hammer. He was trying to break through the wooden door and come inside and murder him. Well, the police came. They thought it was like a regular domestic dispute. They separated the two parties, tried to get each side of the story. And that's when they began hearing grumblings about something down in the wine cellar. And so they went down to the wine cellar. And the wine cellar was one of two rooms in the basement at the time that had a dirt floor. And they started digging because there was a spot on the dirt floor that looked like it had been dug up and, filled in. And they started to dig, and hours later, 4 feet under the surface of the earth, they dug up a blue Rubbermaid storage container, and in it were the remains of Jamey Carroll. He was a 37-year-old hairdresser from the eastern part of the state. He had been shot and stabbed. Maybe his throat had been slashed, they said. He had been hogtied, and they had used a sledgehammer to break his bones to fit him inside this storage bin. And so then the big question was, how'd this guy get down here and why? Who killed him? Well, both Joey and Jeffrey blamed the other. They said the other had killed Jamey. They said the other had forced them to help with the cover-up and disposal of the body. And they both claimed to have been living in fear of the other for the previous 7 months. And so three years later, 2013, Louisville had the most scandalous murder trials it had seen in a long time. A lot of people called it the trial of he said, because they pointed the finger at each other. Other people called it the pink triangle murder because of the gay aspect. Turns out Jamey Carroll, among other things, was the guy's drug dealer, but he was their sometimes boyfriend as well. It turns out they were all in bed that night when Jamey was killed. But the real question was, who killed him and why? And, always being someone who liked to write about Louisville, this was my bailiwick. It's just something kind of fell into my lap. I knew the people involved. It was right around the corner from where I had lived. And I'm nosy, so I went to those trials. I sat through every day of those 3 weeks for each of the trials and kind of tried to piece together, what went on that night, what happened to Jamey Carroll ending up dead in a Rubbermaid tote in the basement of this old house. And it was fascinating. It was fascinating to be in the courtroom and see the courtroom drama. But it was even more fascinating because in talking to locals, neighbors, and then a lot of people in the gay community, because, they were quite well known, and it had a big impact on the gay community. A lot of the locals, they kind of shook their heads and gays causing, trouble again. They really sensationalized the murder, and the gay aspect was a big part of it. So I sat through the trials, I did research, I talked to people trying to figure out what really happened that night. And every time I go back and read my book or go back and look at my trial notes, I come to a different conclusion. There's just so many strange angles to this story. It's a really, really strange story because not only do we have this strange kind of love triangle, the couple and their boyfriend ending up dead. Turns out the house where the body was found has had a spooky past. Most of its existence. There was a sanatorium in the 20s and 30s and 40s there. The doctor practicing there had a bad reputation. He was brought up on ethics charges. He was accused of murdering patients there. Other people had died in the house. They had an S&M club, supposedly down in the basement where the wine cellar was for a brief time, and that led me into down a whole other rabbit hole, because it turns out Louisville has a thriving S&M scene, an underground S&M scene. And when I say underground, I mean literally underground. A number of years ago, down actually that area where the connection was, that kind of area, by the 2nd Street Bridge, there's this place called Whiskey Row. It's a lot of old cast iron fronted buildings, from the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and they were remodeling a restaurant, and in the process they were in the basement, and they broke through the floor into a sub-basement, and they found this whole warren of interlinked S&M clubs. And the big one was called Latex. And it turns out, like from the 70s to the 90s at least, there was this thriving S&M scene in town. And it turns out there's more than that. I got to talk to some people who were involved in the scene. There was kind of a clandestine S&M club in the neighborhood, not too far from the house where the murder took place. So I kind of got tricked into going there one night. That was a really interesting experience. But yeah, the fascinating thing about this trial and this murder and writing this book is all the fascinating things I found out about the Louisville, gay scene. just kind of the fringe groups that we have in the city, and the interesting characters that the city is known for. And it turns out Old Louisville has a lot of interesting characters. So part of the fun of the book was, being out on my own and meeting people and finding out their stories, and from these people getting information that kind of helped me find out more about this terrible murder that took place, and which forms the backbone of the book we were talking about, A Dark Room in Glitterball City.
And, the funny thing about it, that's what brought us together. That's what made me reach out and connect to you. This past Christmas, 2021, a good friend of mine who's been very supportive of my GayBarchives project, his name is Hunter, and he's a professor of LGBT studies locally. And he has encouraged me through the process of researching these bars and reminiscing. He said one thing that would be interesting to him would be gay bars and gay stories that have some sort of a murder or mayhem association to them. So this past Christmas in 2021, he gave me a gift card for Christmas. And I said, well, I'm going to go on Amazon and do a little research, and I'm going to buy a book to further my knowledge in that area. And I stumbled across A Dark Room in Glitterball City, the subtitle being Murder, Secrets, and Scandal in Old Louisville. And I said, that's it. Hunter has to get this for me for Christmas. So I bought the book, and there was still extra money on the card. And I said, what else would I put with that? And so I thought, okay, I'm going to buy a 12-inch mirror ball to add to my little mirror ball collection.
Okay.
And not knowing why it was called Glitterball City, or not knowing anything about it. And I come to find out that one of the fundraisers that have been done involved selling a 12-inch glitter ball from, I think, Starbase Q. That was
Connection.
Oh, Connection.
Yeah,
that
was saved it when they tore it down. Yeah.
So I have the exact same size glitter ball now in my living room.
Cool.
But that's kind of what brought us together. And I started reading the book. And my initial impression when I first opened a book and started reading it is, I hope they get to this, the details of the story early. And then I think it arrived on a Tuesday around lunchtime. And by Wednesday night, I was finished with the book. I could not put it down. There are more interesting details about, drag queens and gay personalities and Old Louisville, and just all kinds of colorful details that made me feel like I was part of the story, not just reading an article on page 6 in the New York Times that said, gruesome murder in gay mansion or something. It's a really compelling story that gives you a good taste for what the city of Louisville was like at that time, what the neighborhood's like, what the community's like, there's all kinds of interesting people in the book that are actually they are actually real people. And I got this strange image of you lurking around in the dark, wearing like all black, like a ninja with a little flashlight, kind of looking in the back alleys and basements of Old Louisville for clues.
Well, it's kind of how I am. I mean, and people, they like, how do you meet these people? Because I tend to meet some really outlandish people. And the thing is, if you put yourself out there, if you just, you go sit on a park bench, and I like to go sit on the park bench like at midnight, or just go walking place. And fortunately, I'm 6'4", weigh like 250 pounds. I'm relatively safe. I know that there are other people, especially women, they don't have that luxury. But I like to go out walking in the middle of the night. And if you just give people a chance, you'll meet people. And if you talk to them, there are so many interesting stories. And so a lot of the interesting characters, well, some of them are friends of mine in the book, and others were just neighborhood people, and some people they're like, well, you made up these people, right? And they're like, nope, and people who live in Old Louisville, they're like, oh yeah, I know who that is. Or, I've had people claim that I made up a lot of these characters, but you talk to anyone in the neighborhood, anyone in the city, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I know who that is." I mean, they will back me up 100% that these are actual real life characters.
And it was a really interesting perspective for me. Several months back, I interviewed the filmmaker Todd Stevens, and probably his most well-known collection of movies is a trilogy that takes place in Sandusky, Ohio. And the first one was The Edge of 17, which came out, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, about a coming out story of a young guy in Sandusky and experiences at the bar and so on. It was made into a movie with Leah Delaria. And the most recent segment of his story is a book called Swan Song, which is about an octogenarian who's in a nursing home and escapes to go back to his old life in downtown Sandusky. And that character is played by Udo Kier, who is very quirky and kind of unbelievably flamboyant for an octogenarian in a small town in Ohio. But the main character in Todd's story was himself coming out as a 17-year-old boy. And Udo Kier plays a main character in the Swan Song movie who is also based on a local character that everybody knows. And so sometimes it's when you talk about the people that are really based in true people that it's the most unbelievable, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you know, truth is always stranger than fiction. And like this, the whole story, the backbone of this book, you know, there's so many crazy details, you just couldn't make it up. And so I definitely agree with you there. Truth is always stranger than fiction.
But you did a great job with the book. And I know this was your, if I'm not mistaken, this was book Lucky 13, right?
Yes, I was hoping it's Lucky 13, yeah. And of course, a lot of my previous books, they were, you know, local books. My first one came out in 2005. So, you know, a lot of those were like haunted history kind of folklore books. Like I said, I was writing cookbooks and travel guides, but this is definitely, it's nonfiction like I usually write, but it's definitely a different genre. And so far, so good. You know, it just came out in October and got a good review in the New York Times. That really helped. And I'm in talks with HBO. They want to turn this into a docuseries. So we're working out the details of some true crime show that's going to come out of this. So hopefully in a couple of years, we'll be able to see this on HBO.
I was just going to ask you that question, if we're going to see a movie or a series out of it, because it is just so rich and colorful and entertaining that I can't imagine, you know, it wouldn't get good ratings as a TV show or movie.
Yeah, well, knock on wood, in a couple of years, let's hope we see something on HBO. Like we're just in the initial phases. We're working things out, but it's looking pretty good so far.
Well, I wish you all the best with that.
Thanks.
You're welcome. And I know you also have another job, so to speak, in addition to your writing, that you run a local tour guide service there in Louisville that is taking tourists and locals and whoever wants to go, anybody who's interested, on tours of old Louisville and talking about the history and the ghost stories and all that. Has that always been an interest ever since you moved there?
You know, and like I said, I moved to Louisville, especially old Louisville. I saw all these beautiful homes and mansions, and it was just a spectacular neighborhood. And I couldn't understand why the city wasn't, you know, doing more to promote that part of the neighborhood, or I should say the city. And so when I started writing my first books, I realized part of it was because I wanted to kind of tout the virtues of the neighborhood. I realized, you know, like I said, you don't have to believe in ghost stories to enjoy a good ghost story, but there's a lot more to ghost stories and paranormal things than just spooky stuff. There's history, there's architecture, there's real life characters. So what I discovered is the stories, the legends, and the folklore that I was writing down kind of served as a vehicle to educate about the neighborhood. So people began reading my stories, and then they wanted to see the places they were reading about. So that's how we got into giving tours. It started off in 2004 as a way to kind of get people on the streets and promote and make money for different neighborhood associations. And as my books keep coming, people want more. And so we do daytime tours, and we do them March through November, 7 days a week. Right now we're in the off season, so my friend Angelique, she's kind of taking over. It's cold, so we don't get as many people, but we're still doing them in the winter as well. But we get people from all over the world. They come at night, they want to hear the haunted history stories. They come during the day, they want to see the architectural details. Everyone wants to see the murder house, as the locals call it. The New York Times wrote up my tours not too long ago, which has been really great. So we get people from all over the world. And I love it because it's a way for me to get out on the streets and just kind of show off this neighborhood that I've fallen in love with. And most people, they come to old Louisville and they're blown away by the beautiful architecture. And like I said, just block after block after old houses and mansions. And so, yeah, I teach at the university. I write. When I'm not doing that, I'm probably down in old Louisville, creeping around with groups, showing people the spooky parts of the neighborhood, some of the hidden parts of the neighborhood, trying to kind of show off the best parts of the neighborhood, the more picturesque parts of this beautiful Victorian neighborhood they call Old Louisville.
Now, just so people don't get the wrong impression that you're from some tiny little town in Wisconsin and you move to Louisville and think you're in the big city, you are quite the avid traveler. I mean, you've experienced cities around the world. You enjoy traveling. You enjoy experiencing cuisine all over the place. And in fact, right now you're in Mexico, correct?
Yeah, I'm in Mexico right now. I love Mexico. I used to study here when I was in my younger years, but most of my 20s I lived or studied abroad. I lived in Austria for 5 years. I was in Germany for a year, Italy and Spain for half a year. I volunteered. My first trip ever was to go to the Philippines and volunteer one summer. But yeah, I travel whenever I can. The first 3 weeks in December, I was in Mexico, and I came back for Christmas. And then after Christmas, I flew to Munich, Germany, which I love. I normally take students there, but this year, COVID kind of ruined all that. So I had my plane tickets, so I still went. I went to Lyon, France, I went to Paris, went to Istanbul, went to London, kind of goofed around and got back in Louisville to start my spring semester classes at the university, and then hopped on a plane and I'm in Mexico for the next 3 weeks. So I'm gonna do some online teaching while I'm down here.
The reason I wanted to mention that is because it puts a different perspective on your appreciation of Louisville. It's not like Louisville is the greatest place or the most historic place you've ever been, but you've lived there and you've gotten to know the charm of the city. And so yeah, it puts a different spin on your opinion of what Louisville is like compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I think it might be the fact that I had lived around the world before I ended up in Louisville. And what happens is a lot of times you don't appreciate, what's in your own backyard. And so a lot of times, Americans, they leave and they discover good things about their country, but then they discover other things that aren't so great about their country. So, but I came back and I was just, I don't know, I had this appreciation for history and architecture that I had always had, but I kind of tuned it, I guess, in Louisville, and it turned out to be a good place to do that. So I discovered another reason why I do the books and do the tours is in Louisville, they're not boastful people for the most part. They're kind of understated. And so being an out-of-towner myself, I see the neighborhood in fresh eyes, and I can kind of take it upon myself to tell people what's great about the city, what's great about this neighborhood. Whereas the locals, maybe they don't think they're, the old-timers, I should say, maybe they don't think, they're worthy of it, or they don't think that the city is all that great. But someone like me who comes and sees it with fresh eyes, they have a different take on it. And the books I write, the tours I give, kind of lets me continue to do this, to let people know what an interesting place Louisville is and why they should come see us. So if you're ever down there, let me know and I'll show you around the neighborhood.
Awesome. I am so glad that you ended up moving to Louisville, because as part of this project, one of my hardest things to do is to track down information on obscure places. You know, I can find all the information I want on Studio 54. Nobody needs to hear that.
Yeah.
And by you highlighting a story from, you know, as you said, a second tier city in Kentucky, it brought more information to me and helped me expand my research of gay bars. So I really appreciate what you've done with that, and
Good.
and what you've done, you know, highlighting the story, which is, I think everybody should read that book. I will definitely put a link up in the end so people can find it, but I think everybody should read the book. It's a great book and it's a very interesting story. So thank you for sharing the story of your experience in Louisville and the bars that are there. And I just can't say enough. Thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, and good luck. I look forward to hearing more of your shows in the future.
That concludes another episode of the GayBarchives show. For more information about this episode or to find more episodes, visit GayBarchives.com.